Coming up,
I took a bullet for democracy.
Better buckle your seatbelts.
he's the master of mouthing off,
It's going to get ruthless and dirty.
the big shot of bluster.
Oh, give me a break.
Liar.
Rapist. Is she Indian or is she black?
Is he a bully?
Yes.
But has Donald Trump now gone too far?
Donald said he doesn't recognize you, let him die, and move to Florida.
That's next on 60 Minutes.
Hello again and welcome to our Extra Minutes, 60 Minutes podcast. My name is Dimity Clancey and today we're going to be talking all about the US election. So I have my beautiful colleague and political expert, all things US politics,
Yeah.
Amelia Adams.
Well, there's
Thank
plenty
you for
happening,
joining
that's
us.
for sure.
Absolutely. You have just come back from the States.
Yeah.
What's happening over there?
Oh, it's wild. But I mean, the most significant thing is how much the presidential race has changed just in the last couple of months. If we go back a couple of months, you had this incredible, I guess, resurgence of Donald Trump, who quite unbelievably, as a convicted felon, someone that I think a lot of people in America, in Australia and right around the world never imagined could be president again.
How does it even happen?
Well, it's a good question. And yet I can tell you last week, travelling across 3 different states, the fact that he is a convicted criminal has completely dropped off the radar. And a couple of months ago, he was certainly the front runner. You had this race between 2 old white men who the majority of Americans expressed through polling that, you know, neither of them were their first choice of who to vote for. And it was a pretty stagnant race, but it was a race that Donald Trump looked to be winning, which of course got totally upended, beginning with the first presidential debate in which we saw Joe Biden was really not fit and competent.
I have to say, I really felt for him, though, in those moments where you could just see that he couldn't catch his
Well,
mind.
I mean, he shouldn't have been there, but that's another issue. Closely following that, which gave Donald Trump, of course, a huge boost, he survived this assassination attempt, which in the eyes of the loyal MAGA base made him even more of a hero.
Well, he took a bullet for democracy.
Well, that's
as
right.
he would put it.
His ear did anyway. And everything was going very well for him until Vice President Kamala Harris got the Democratic nomination, and she had an initial surge, which I think is not surprising. You get that honeymoon period. She really injected a lot of enthusiasm into the race, and I think there was relief that Joe Biden wouldn't be running. And quite surprisingly, she has continued that momentum. And she's now really edged ahead of Donald Trump in key states. And you've got to remember, of course, this US election will be won, as it always is, in just a handful of states.
7, isn't it?
Yeah, and she's ahead of him. She's really sort of made up ground and then taken the lead, at least in like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, all states that Donald Trump won quite surprisingly in 2016, and then won them back in 2020. They're key to any presidential victory. She's looking good in those states at the moment. She's looking good in the Sunbelt states where Biden was starting to struggle, so Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina. So now we've got a real race.
But why do people like her? Is it because it's Kamala Harris or is it because it's not Joe Biden?
That's a really good question. I think probably at this point it's because it's not Joe Biden.
So people are just relieved.
Yes. You've got to remember that the vice president's role it's a difficult one because, yes, it's a huge gig, but it's also, you know, your co-pilot, or not even, you're in the back seat. You're meant to be in the shadows. You're not there to lead and be front of public policy and mind. You're there to help the president implement his or her policies. So even in America, and I think certainly here talking to Australian friends and family, but even in America talking to people there, she is still relatively unknown, which is really interesting.
What are going to be her biggest challenges? Because it's quite close, right? There's only a couple of points between them.
It's so tight.
And it could swing
It's so tight.
either way. So
Yeah.
what are the big things that she really has to nail to get over the line?
I think she has to prove that she is a candidate in her own right. You know, we know she's been in the White
Not by
House
default.
for 4 years. Yeah, exactly. She's been in the White House for 4 years. And whilst we may not have seen her at the forefront of a lot of big national security or foreign policy things, of course she has been involved in those things. For example, when Australia signed the AUKUS deal with America and Britain, and really annoyed, searching for the word there, the French, really chuffed off the French. It was Kamala Harris that was sent to Emmanuel Macron. She went to Paris. She went to smooth diplomatic relations. She's done a lot of international visits and dealing with foreign leaders. It just, she's not at the forefront of it because she's not the president. So I think she'll, and we started to see in her Democratic Convention speech, bringing in some of that strong language and like national security type focus, basically reminding Americans and trying to convince them that I've got those strengths as well, and I can, negotiate with Putin or whoever it is, because those are the real attack lines for the Trump campaign. And there's also
that's the scary part as well, isn't it? If he was to make it through, what sort of implications in terms of those dictators could we be facing?
Well, we don't know, is the truth, because Trump has said constantly, for example, that he'll end the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He'll end the war between Russia and Ukraine within a day. Now, there's all sorts of, terrifying theories about what that might be. He doesn't like NATO. We know that. Would he pull out of NATO? The implications of that potential are quite scary. So it's very difficult to know. We know he's sort of cozied up to Xi Jinping in the past. I think
that's why I mean, and I guess that's why people call it would be dangerous if he got through.
Yeah, and I think there's certainly fair concerns. I mean, the language that he uses around I'd end the war and I'd do this, and I think it's fair that people are concerned. I think the likelihood of
does he mean it?
Well, this is what we don't know, because he's a very unpredictable person. He's threatened revenge in the past. He's quite backward looking. He's quite focused on, and these are his own words, seeking revenge for people who he perceives to do him wrong. I think that at the moment is damaging his campaign. I think he's scrambling to reset because he was probably going to beat Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And now with this change in candidate, he's kind of blown himself up, really. He keeps personally attacking Kamala Harris.
Yeah. Is she Indian or is she black?
Well,
I mean, when he makes those sort of comments, does he know? Or is he just that delusional? I don't.
Well,
you hear someone in that position say something like that.
And look, you can say many things about Donald Trump. You don't get to become president by being completely politically stupid. Yeah. So he's speaking in a lot of those things to his fan base as well. And just, I think, spreading confusion and throwing mud is, that's his playbook, isn't it?
But it's mud that's going to stick, right?
Well, maybe. I think Kamala Harris has always, which is what's so odd about it, embraced her mixed race background,
But making those sort of comments, I mean, how...
Yeah, it's derogatory.
Yeah.
But
what does it do to his chances?
It's very strange behaviour. He has been warned. I know this from talking to people connected to the Trump campaign. He has been warned against these continued personal attacks. He's called her dumb as a rock. He said, I'm better looking than her. It does nothing for him at this point. And I could just sense in the last week or so, even some of his language in ads has shifted, as though he's trying to appear a little more moderate, because she's gained this sort of moral high ground. And she's out there pitching herself as this fresh, enthusiastic, young, because that's been, the age thing's been taken out, young candidate for change, interestingly enough. And voters seem to be buying it. I mean, if you look at the polls.
In your last story, we met a member of Donald Trump's family, and talk about airing your family's dirty laundry.
I know.
Fred Trump.
Yes. Fred III, quick history lesson, because I found this confusing. Donald Trump's father, Fred Sr., Donald Trump's brother, Fred Jr., and Donald Trump's nephew, Fred Jr.'s son, Fred III. So there's a lot of Fred Trumps.
F3.
And the Fred that I met was Fred III. And Fred Jr., Donald Trump's brother, died when he was just 42. And after that, Donald Trump rallied his surviving siblings to cut Fred Jr.'s children out of the family will and estate? Well, it's a good question. And I spoke to Fred because he's just written a tell-all book, and it is a book about the greed and the focus on money and power in the Trump Valley, which I think we all know if you've read any of Donald Trump's books or books about him. And in fact, it's not the first family member. Fred III's sister, Mary, wrote her tell-all back in 2020 with some explosive claims about her uncle. So now he's done the same, but it's a very different story, and I don't think anyone will be surprised by claims that Donald Trump is a bully and a racist, which he gets into. But what's markedly different and I think quite disturbing about Fred's story is Fred has a very severely disabled son. William's 25, but he was born with severe seizures and epilepsy, and basically from the day he was born, these seizures were shutting down his brain. He's nonverbal. He can't, he's in a wheelchair. He can't do anything on his own. He's now in an adult care home, but he's a much loved part of their family, and Fred and his wife have really understandably devoted their life to caring for him and also advocating for disabled Americans.
So you think if you had a member of your family who was living with a disability that you would have a great understanding, and somebody in Donald Trump's position could be quite powerful in that, backing them.
Well, that's what Fred had hoped. And before Donald Trump became president, Fred rang him and said, Uncle Donald, the medical fund, which was set up by the family estate, is running low. William needs more care. Can we have a conversation about it? And he said that his uncle said to him on the phone, he doesn't recognise you. You should just let him die. Which is a pretty horrific thing to say about your own great-nephew. Then when it was President Donald Trump in the White House, Fred persevered, and he actually had a delegation of people meeting in the Oval Office to discuss advocating for better care, more efficient care for severely disabled Americans. And his uncle Donald, President Donald Trump, was present at the meeting and sat quietly. And then when everyone had left the room, he says his uncle said to him, those people, the money, the care, they should just die. So
they're obviously jabs at his nephew, right? But don't take it out on the child, especially a child who's living with so many challenges.
No, and it's deeply personal, as you say. It is a horrible public airing of laundry. Fred says he's telling these stories now because he wants Americans to know exactly what type of man
that they would
is
be
running.
For.
Yeah, would be re-elected. It's deeply personal, but it does speak to Donald Trump's personality. And to be honest, it's not the first we've heard of his attitude towards people with disabilities. I mean, when he was president, his staff, several staff, reported that he said he didn't want to be seen with wounded veterans. It wasn't a good look for him. He seems to have some issue.
There was a journalist, a reporter as well.
Yeah, it's who he mocked, a disabled reporter. So I think he seems to have some issue around being seen with people who are potentially vulnerable or weak or have a disability, which is pretty alarming when you're talking about, qualities of leadership and what sort of a person you would want to be leading.
And what sort of, who are the people that want to support that?
Yeah, that's right. And you'd think that Donald Trump would need to, as any presidential candidate needs to, talk to Americans and talk in terms that are relatable and show empathy. Whatever your problem is or your perceived problem is, I'm going to find a way to help you solve it. I'm going to find a way to give you more money or make your community, your family, your state, whatever it is, better. Like, that is leadership. So it's certainly...
It's heart.
Yeah,
it's compassion.
Heart. It's heart. So it certainly throws that into doubt, but I'm not sure too many people would be surprised by Fred Trump's awful stories.
And also, how many people will actually listen? If they're choosing just to ignore that he's a convicted felon and it doesn't matter and we just push that to the side, it doesn't matter, they'll probably do the same thing.
Well, you've raised a really good point, and I think that's something that's important to hold on to as we head into these last couple of months of campaigning. For anyone who's sitting there kind of watching Donald Trump and pulling their hair out, going, how can, he be saying these things and how can so many people vote for him? His supporters truly believe what he says. But, so many of them who I have personally met and talked to and gone to rallies with and interviewed as well do not believe. Like, they would look at Fred Trump's stories and say, oh, he never said that. It's just a smear.
He's just a disgruntled nephew.
They do not believe that he committed any crimes. They believe the Department of Justice and the Biden administration were out to attack him and he hasn't done anything wrong. And that comes from, of course, the man himself, because that's what he's been saying. And I saw,
But what about the stuff he gets up at rallies and says on the stage? They can't not believe that because they're seeing it and hearing it with their own eyes and ears.
Well, he can say what he wants. That's a beautiful thing about politics.
It washes off.
I saw that he's said that the Biden administration, specifically, he's named Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as being responsible for, but involved in, he pretty much did point the finger at them, the assassination attempt against him, because they made it difficult for the Secret Service to protect him. Now, I can tell you I've been to Butler, Pennsylvania, which is the town where that assassination attempt took place, and I have spoken to people that were at that rally, and they firmly believe that it was all orchestrated by the Biden administration in a conspiracy theory to take Donald Trump out of the race because he was going to win. So
I think those theories are only going to get worse and more interesting leading up to the election.
Yes, there'll be many more twists and turns, I'm sure.
The Harris honeymoon, is that going to get her all the way
we'll
to November?
See. As I said, I mean, that's a personal opinion. I was surprised. The initial surge in the polls felt right and felt predictable. But if you look at it now, and especially, as I said, those key states and the Sunbelt states, she's just ahead, but just ahead to enough. And we've had now, both parties have had their national conventions.
I want to talk about those.
We really are getting into the absolutely pointy end of the race. So
it's like the finale of the big shows, right?
I feel like the Trump campaign needs to decide what they're attacking about her now.
Yep.
As she needs to continue to really define herself and who she is and what type of president she would be, because that's what a lot of Americans I've been speaking to in the past week or two over there are still a little unsure about.
You've been to countless campaign rallies. I want to paint the picture. You walk in there, you're there to cover it, you're there to speak to people. Where do you start? What's it like?
Well, I should start by saying I've been to countless Trump campaign rallies because the Democratic and Biden campaign rallies I went to were quite limited during the last US election when I was living there and working in our bureau. It was COVID. So Joe Biden had strict rules around going out in public, and actually he was just following this sort of public health advice. Donald Trump wasn't. So we still went to these huge rallies, and
they'd be far more colourful though.
They were very colourful, but, for example, we would go up onto the media risers, so you have the media stage that you take your camera gear up to and you stand there, and we would be screamed abuse. People would scream abuse at us if we were wearing our mask. And this was at a time when masks were, still mandatory in America. Lots of costumes, lots of paraphernalia, lots of pump-up songs. A Trump rally is it's almost like a rock concert, and he is the superstar. So you have all these build-up acts. Sometimes you have speakers, sometimes you have music. But when he comes out on stage, he's a demagogue. It is still quite extraordinary, the following that he has. And his rally speeches, I personally think haven't changed a great deal in, 8 years. They still have the same key themes and the same key attack lines, but his supporters believe it.
The same supporters
and
probably
will lead
too,
it up.
right?
Yeah.
What were they like when they would speak to you? Are they just all in, aren't they?
They are, but you've got to remember, I mean, there's a slight difference between your hardcore MAGA base that, people, for example, that went along to January 6th. There's a difference between hardcore MAGA supporters and there's a lot of everyday Republicans who don't necessarily go to rallies and they don't necessarily like Donald Trump at all. And, it's important to remind Australians, because I think sometimes we get a bit of a, Trump's crazy, therefore all his supporters must be crazy. You really can't say that about 50% of the population, who nearly 50% that voted for him last time and that may vote for him this time. I have met so many very intelligent, highly educated mum and dad Republicans all around the country, and they vote for Donald Trump. And
but they don't necessarily
because they
support his ways.
No, they support conservative policies, or they're small business owners and they're really worried about the economy, or they really, really dislike democratic values and policies, and that's enough to make them vote for a man they don't particularly like, but a party that they prefer. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And, you know,
but it's not just all about the two people.
No, and we see the extreme side of MAGA. We see those really hyped up crowds and fans, and we see him often speaking total untruths on stage. But, you know, the balance of that is lots of working class Americans, lots of Black Americans, you know, have very good reasons why they think the Republican Party would be much better for them to be in government, and they will vote for Donald Trump in November.
The riots that you also attended, just give us an insight into those.
Oh, just trying to trigger me here.
Sorry. Sorry.
No, I'm kidding. Well, again...
but I guess you then, like when you say what we see here in Australia,
yes,
you know, it's those sort of scenes as well.
Yeah, that's right. That gives you that really sort of, my gosh, America's lost the plot.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's a fair point of view as well. It was a real period of unrest, certainly between the summer, or the American summer of 2020, really sparked by the death in police custody of George Floyd, and that was my introduction to riots in that country.
Yep.
You know, right through to obviously January the 6th.
What did it feel like being amongst that?
I think
trying to cover it.
Well, yeah, and I mean, you know what it's like when you switch into work mode and you've just got to get up there and sort of keeping your wits about you, but also get up as, you know, as close as you can so you can actually see what's happening, film what's happening, and also communicate what's happening in a rolling live coverage situation. I really hope we don't see any more of that after November. I do think it's going to be a very, very close election. I could be wrong. We're a couple of months out, and you know, the worry is the closer it is, the tighter that result is. If it's not ultimately in Donald Trump's favour, he's already setting the stage for a rigged election, and then it's, you know, how he incenses his support base around
certainly
that.
not over in November.
No.
If you went with your gut, red or blue?
Oh, too early to say. I mean, if I had to call it today, actually, I don't know. I still think Trump might win today.
Wow.
But the way she's tracking, I think maybe in 2 months, you know, the Democrats it could be similar to 2020. They could pull ahead.
It's a long time in politics.
It's a long time in politics. There's some states where I think, you know, Biden was really struggling. I think he just had lost that ability to connect with voters, and people had quite rightly probably decided he was too old to run for another term and lost faith. And it seems like Kamala Harris is now picking up some of those states, so we'll see.
And, of course, you can watch Amelia's coverage of the US election leading up to November. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Mills.
Thanks, Tim.
We'll see you next time.